In today's video, we're going to be looking at all of these orchids which are in spike for the month of November. And we'll be talking a little bit about winter prep. All of this and more coming up at the Orchid Hut. Welcome back to the Orchid Hut. My name is Dana, and yes, I'm pretty much covered up by orchids at the beginning of today's video. It's been a little while since I've made a video, so I'll be doing a little bit of life updates along the way here today. And before we can even start, I'll need to clear some of these out so that we can go orchid by orchid. You know, I was outside today getting ready to bring all of my outdoor, well, most of my outdoor orchids in, because this time of year it begins to get a little too cool overnight and in the early morning hours for many of them to stay outside. At least it's not their preference. And eventually I'll have to be bringing them all in for winter anyway. And you know, I'm actually rather pleased that they were able to stay out through the beginning of November, because sometimes I do have to bring them in towards the end of October. And you know, as I was going pot by pot and kind of tidying up and really inspecting all of the plants, I noticed how many of them were in spike or about ready to bloom, and I thought, what a great video, because you know, you don't usually think of November and December as a big blooming time for orchids, but you know, here in my climate, that's sort of how it goes, because they've had their growing season outdoors where it's nice and warm, and yeah, they're ready to bloom now. Now, you might notice that there's not a single Phalaenopsis in this bunch. And that's true, because I don't have any Phalaenopsis orchids starting to spike yet, but we have not really had cool temperatures indoors, but for maybe 1 or 2 nights. And you know, that's not extended enough for the Phalaenopsis to respond to cooler weather. Usually my Phalaenopsis orchids don't begin to spike until later November, December, sometimes even January or February. So we're going to be looking at orchids today that are not Phalaenopsis. All right, I will be right back. I'm going to clear a few of these out of the way, and we're going to take them one by one and look a little bit closer at how they're getting ready to bloom. Okay, I'll be right back. The first 2 orchids that we're going to start with today are actually kind of related to each other. This first one that I'm going to show you is Brassavola nodosa. It is a species orchid, and it is a little bit difficult to handle because it's in this clay pot with a wire hanging rod. But this has been growing in a clay pot quite happily for a number of years, 2 years at least, maybe 3. And I counted earlier when I brought it in, and it has 4 spikes on it currently. 1, 2, 3, 4, yes. And this is the one that is the most developed. It's the longest, and it was the first to show up. And then there are 3 others in various stages of development. Now, because the blooms on this orchid do last for a number of weeks, I do expect that all of these spikes will be in bloom at least for a short time all together simultaneously. So I'm really looking forward to that. This one really earns its name, Lady of the Night, because at night it becomes fragrant. In the wild, that is the way that this orchid reproduces, because it attracts pollinators with that fragrance. So really looking forward to this one blooming again. I think it's the first time I've had 4 spikes at once. I think last year I just had 3. All right, let me step over here with this orchid and set it aside. You know, every time I'm handling my orchids with spikes on them, I'm partially holding my breath because I don't want to snap one. Okay, now this orchid is Little Stars, and one of its parents is the previous orchid that I showed you, the species orchid Brassavola nodosa. So you can kind of see that these 2 orchids are related. They look a little bit alike. This one is going to need to be repotted after the blooming season. It has filled up the pot and the media is starting to break down a bit. So when this one is done blooming, I will be repotting it. I counted earlier when I brought this one in, and I believe it has 10 spikes on it. So I'm going to tilt the pot here so that you can see a little bit better. This is the largest of the spikes. And then as you come around this way, you'll see spikes in various stages of development. And again, this is a rather long blooming orchid. So many of these, I think, will be open at the same time, just because it stays in bloom so long. And like its parent, Brassavola nodosa, this orchid is also fragrant at night. So when I put both of these in the sort of secondary grow space for the winter, and I close the door at night, when I walk in there in the morning, it's just unbelievably fragrant with both of these two orchids blooming at the same time. Okay, now one other thing I want to point out on this one in particular before I move on to the next batch of orchids. If you can see, a number of the leaves have this purple spotting on them, and that's anthocyanin. It's a pigment, and the orchid produces that when it is exposed to a good amount of sunlight. And I do believe that's the reason why this one has so many spikes on it, is because it was getting the proper amount of light towards the end of the growing season without getting sunburned. So sometimes that's a fine balance to strike, but I do believe that's the reason why this one is going to bloom so nicely this year. Last year I think I had only 4 spikes, and if I didn't miscount, I counted at least 10 on this plant now. All right, so let's go ahead and move on to the next group of orchids. I'll be right back. Okay, on to the next orchid. This one is rather tall. And before I start with this orchid, I'll just give you a few little life updates in case you're interested. The month of October was unbelievably busy. We did take a vacation to Lake Tahoe and Reno, which was really, really nice. But then the rest of the month just seemed to be filled with so much busyness. Doctor's appointments and taking care of other people. And, you know, it just seemed like there were so many things that we had to get done during the month of October. As far as the orchids went, you know, they were kind of just coasting along during the month of October, enjoying the last month of the growing season. Here in Southeast Texas, we didn't particularly have a lot of rain, a little bit, but not a lot. So, you know, I was just adjusting my watering scheduling, and I was being very, very careful to move them into shadier locations, because as the sun was getting lower in the sky, some of them were getting exposed to a little bit too much sunlight coming in under the canopy of the trees in my backyard. So that's always the risk that I have towards the end of the growing season in October, well, really like end of September into October, and then again in March when I'm usually able to put the orchids back outside, I have to watch that they're not getting sunburned. Once the sun gets high in the sky during the summer months, it's not a problem because they're underneath the canopy of the trees. So, you know, that's really about all I was doing. Now, as far as winter prep goes, I typically spend a little bit more time getting ready to bring the orchids indoors. In fact, sometimes I will put them in the garage for a while and make sure all the bugs are off, make sure there aren't any ants in the pots, etc., etc., clean them up, you know, top off the pot with media if that's needed, clean off the dry sheaths, cut off the dead leaves, you know, all of that good stuff. And I kind of a few weeks ago knew that I needed to be doing that, but it was still just so busy, I just really didn't have the time to deal with it. So, because I know this cold weather is coming in a couple of days with a lot of wind, I had to kind of shortcut my process this year. And I am just taking the last final days of their outdoor growing, and I'm bringing them in one by one, and I'm cleaning them up, adding media if needed, kind of assessing whether I'm going to need to repot them after they're finished blooming. And then I'm also, for the bare-rooted ones, I'm giving them a really good outdoor bucket soak, both today and tomorrow, before I bring the bare-rooted ones in. And for these orchids that I'm showing you today, I filled the kitchen sink up with water, and I just let the pot sit in the water in the sink for a while. And believe it or not, that did flush out a few creepy crawlies that I will be just as happy not to have in the secondary grow space over the winter. So, you know, thankfully I didn't find any ants. That's usually the worst problem that I find. So far so good. It doesn't seem like me shortcutting the process this year has necessarily been a bad thing, but I am doing it differently just because of life circumstances. Okay, so this next orchid that I want to show you is Brassalia Cattleya Copper Queen. And, you know, throughout the video, you may have noticed little links in the upper right-hand corner of the screen for other videos that I've done in the past. And it might be that same orchid when I repotted it, or maybe that same orchid when I bought it and it was in bloom, or maybe that orchid when it was a first-time bloomer for me. So, you know, as the video goes along, I'm linking as many of those to this video as I can in case you want to go back and see how this orchid looked previously when I added it to my collection or possibly repotted it. This one, I have a very specific memory of it, and this is not the first time this one is going to bloom for me, but I do remember the first time it bloomed, the petals were a wee bit wonky, and I did a first time bloomer video for this one, and you know, I said, oh, you know, I'm happy that it bloomed, but the petals are a little off. So I'm curious what's going to happen this time. There's one bud right here, and then there are two more right here. So it's going to have 3 blooms this time, and I'll be curious if it has sort of straightened out its genetic glitch for producing odd blooms. I think anyway it's a genetic glitch. Now, one other thing to point out with this orchid, because this is a win, this is a gigantic win. I don't want to tilt the pot here too much, but you'll notice that this one kind of grows along a very straight rhizome that takes up a lot of space. It starts at one end of the pot and it grows straight across to the other edge of the pot. I was very fortunate this year. There were 2 new growths that didn't follow that pattern. They actually came off the middle of this long rhizome. So this was a new growth where these 2 buds are, and then this other growth where the 1 bud is was also the new growth. And so it's a win because this didn't really need to be repotted for next year's growing season. And now that it has not added on those new growths at the end of the long rhizome, I'm just going to be adding a little bit of media probably right here, so that when this puts down its new roots, it's a little bit closer to some media, and I can probably squeeze out another year in this pot without having to repot it. So that's really nice when a long rhizome decides to put out the new growth, not at the very tail end. Okay, so when this one blooms again, I'll at the very least, take a picture of it and put it in the community post section so you can see whether or not these blooms were formed correctly or not. Okay, on to the next orchid. Now, this is one of the more odd orchids in my collection. It happens to be a hybrid by the name of Cycnoches. And, you know, when I bought this orchid, it didn't really look like much, and I caught a lot of grief from my husband, who kept teasing me that I bought the ugliest orchid on the planet. You know, when it was growing in the nursery, it had grown this rather large growth right here, and it had an awful lot of blooms on it. And I bought it when it was kind of leafless like this, and then repotted it for the growing season this year in complete sphagnum moss. And this year, the orchid produced this smaller growth right here, as well as this one which is bigger than the largest growth from the previous year. Now you can tell this one is already going into dormancy. During the month of October, every single leaf, and it probably had about 8 leaves on it, every single leaf turned yellow and fell off. And when those leaves started turning yellow, this particular growth for this year did have another bud on it, but something got to it in the growing room and kind of nibbled a little hole into it, and then that particular bud was lost. So it does have another bud right here. Hopefully you can see it in between the stakes, right here. And, you know, I'm really protecting this one now. I'm putting it in a safe place at night so that nothing can come nibble on this particular bud, because I'm really anxious to see this one bloom. And this is characteristic of this orchid. You know, it goes into dormancy in October an awful lot like a Oncidium will do, and as it's going into dormancy it starts to bloom. And I suppose, you know, depending on the light and other growing factors, that will determine how many spikes it set. But you can see on the growth from the previous year, there was one back here, 2, 3. There were at least 3, maybe even 4 spikes on it last year. And this year it had 2, and I've got 1 left, so I'm really, really hoping this one makes it. Okay, so cross your fingers. I will definitely feature this as a first-time bloomer if that bud continues to do well. Okay, on to the next orchid. Okay, now this is another species orchid by the name of Laelia purpurata, and its variety sanguinae, if I'm pronouncing that correctly. This orchid has had a little bit of trouble getting adjusted to my growing environment. It seems to be doing a bit better this year compared to last. It did produce this one new growth right here, which is rather small, but nonetheless, if I can get the camera to focus on it, it does have a sheath forming in the center of that leaf. So hopefully the camera is able to focus in on the sheath growing on this new leaf right here. Now, it could be faking me out, because a lot of times a sheath will form and then you find out a little bit later on that it's a false sheath, which means the sheath formed, but there's no bud inside that's going to turn into a bloom. It's kind of just empty. So that could be the case here, but you know, I'm anxious to see this develop and see how it turns out. I'll show you an example on this other plant of a false sheath. Now, this plant is, look at the name here, Lutamaniana, and it is an extremely healthy looking plant, and it has not bloomed for me, and I have not seen it bloom, but this year one of the new growths put on a sheath right here. As it turns out, it's very much a false sheath, because you can feel it and it is completely empty on the inside. Now, fingers crossed, I have another chance here. Let me see if I can find this. Yes. Okay, there was also a new growth right here, and you can see inside this particular leaf that there's the possibility of another sheath that might turn into a bloom. So the first one, definitely false, it's empty, but there's a chance for a second. We'll see what happens. If it turns out to be a bloom, this will be a first-time bloomer for me. Okay, moving on to the very last orchid. Well, second to last. I'll be right back. Okay, the second to the last orchid that is spiking or in bud for the month of November is my Oncidium Sherry Baby. This one is Red Fantasy. Now, I added this to my collection a couple of years ago. I bought it, I believe, at Trader Joe's, and it had this ginormous pseudobulb right here with a bloom on it. So I have seen this one bloom before. It was blooming when I purchased it, and this is still the stem from the bloom. And you know, it has since put on some new growth, and I repotted it in this clay pot, and it's only potted in leca, some sponge rock, and charcoal. And I remember when I did this repotting video, I caught a little bit of grief in the comments about, you can't grow an orchid without bark. And I was like, well, yes, you can. You just have to, you know, make sure that you give it the moisture that it wants and needs. And sure, an orchid can be happy growing in inorganic media. And I knew this one was doing fine from a healthy plant standpoint. I don't know if the camera can pick up on it, but I was able to notice that there were roots growing down inside the pot, because I can see the root through the drainage hole. There's one there. And if I look over here, you could see that a root was growing out of a drainage hole. So I could also tell that all of the pseudobulbs were staying nice and plump and hydrated. So I knew it was a healthy plant. It was just a matter of, you know, is it going to bloom again for me? And it's done well in this pot. You know, I would not change the setup for this particular plant because it's enjoying this. Well, here we go. So yes, I have my very first bloom spike right here on Sherry Baby. And we'll see how this goes. If this develops into a nice pretty spike with a bloom, it will be a first-time bloomer for me. Now, one of the other things to kind of take note of when you buy an orchid, especially like this, an Oncidium, from a big box store, and you see these ginormous pseudobulbs, and then your own pseudobulbs start to grow, and you go, wait a minute, how come mine aren't growing that large? Does that mean there's something wrong with the plant? Does that mean, you know, I'm not doing something properly? And the answer is probably no, because when these are grown in nurseries to send out to the big box stores, they're in, number one, probably the perfect growing condition, which is going to be hard to replicate. And these plants are also given hormones and other kinds of treatments to cause them to almost grow in an oversized kind of way, because these orchids are going to be shipped out and they have to look really impressive in order to be able to be sold at places like Trader Joe's or your grocery store or even your local nursery. So don't despair if your growths do not match the size of the ones that were grown by the grower. That doesn't mean that your orchid won't bloom for you. Okay, so always hold out hope. All right, on to the very last orchid. We're going outside for this one. Okay, we're going to end today's video with Brassalia yellow bird. We have some yard work equipment in the background and probably the noise of some little children. Okay, so this one has 3 spikes on it. This is the largest of the 3, and it's probably not going to bloom simultaneously. There's another sheath forming right here, and I have no idea if the camera is in focus. And then there is another bloom developing right here. Okay, so this one will be coming inside as well, probably sometime tomorrow. It has done rather well in this basket. Okay, so this is the end of the video. If you enjoyed it or learned something new, please give it a thumbs up. The subscribe button is coming up in the bottom right hand corner of the screen, and don't forget the notifications bell to subscribe. It will let you know when I've posted something new. Okay, thank you all so much for watching. My shelf outdoors, my growing shelf outdoors is looking rather empty now, but so it goes for the winter growing season. Talk to you next time.